We will begin our fourth in our series of Watershed Discipleship conversations with authors of an anthology that will be out at the end of this year, looking at various aspects of bioregional faith and practice. Thank you for joining us for this July monthly BCM webinar, and welcome also to those of you who may be watching this as a recording. We're delighted to have with us today two of the contributors to the Watershed Discipleship Anthology. In the middle, a rose between two thorns, is Sasha Adkins. Sasha is an environmental health researcher with strong interests in ecological justice and endocrine disruption. You'll hear about that this evening. Sasha holds a master's degree in international public health and is a doctoral candidate, almost done, with a dissertation in environmental studies. As you'll hear tonight, Sasha has lived on a sailboat in an eco-village and in many, many other places. Sasha is currently based at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, where Sasha is teaching a variety of environmental studies programs. Sasha, we're really delighted to have you. Thanks for joining us. Sasha will present first. After Sasha is done, you will hear from Matt Humphrey. Matt is on your right on the screen. Matt works to integrate the life of faith with practices of caring for creation with his partner Roxy and their children. Since earning his master's degree in theological studies from Regent College there in Vancouver, British Columbia, Matt has worked with Arocha Canada, a Christian environmental stewardship organization, as an educator and practitioner. Alongside overseeing experiments in sustainable agriculture, Humphrey teaches geography and environmental theology through partnerships with churches, colleges, and community groups. I'll switch screens here so that we can run a little bit of a point. We're just so delighted, both Sasha and Matt, that you are able to join us for this fourth in our series. I want to say to all of you out there in webinar land, first of all, a very happy solstice. We are within the 24-hour window of the actual solstice, and I hope that you are enjoying that wherever you may be. I also want to remind you that this is part of a 5-month series on watershed discipleship, in which you're hearing from many of the authors of the anthology. It began with a conversation between myself and Denise Nadeau and Rose Berger, who wrote some of the front matter to the anthology. In the second month, Lydia Wiley-Kellerman and Aaron Fahey, both in Detroit, talked about the water justice struggle there. And last month, Jonathan McRae and Dave Pritchett, two permaculturists from East and West Coast, respectively, presented those. Those broadcasts are all available as recordings if you want to catch up. And as soon as we finish this series, which we will do next month with our final contributors, Katerina Friesen and Vickie Machado. Katerina will be talking to us from Elkhart, Indiana, and Vickie from Florida. And they'll be talking about their respective work. That will be the final month in our series, and we will bundle all of these webinars together into a Bartimaeus Institute online course on watershed discipleship. And again, of course, the book will be out at the end of this year. So it's been a real delight to converse with each of these practitioners and theorists of watershed discipleship. And tonight our focus is on some very specific issues having to do with a particular environmental catastrophe that Sasha is going to talk to us about, and a particular bioregional set of struggles that Matt is going to talk to us about. So without further ado, I welcome again Sasha Adkins, and Sasha, take it away. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It has really been a pleasure being part of the Watershed Discipleship group, and I've been learning so much. This boat is not the boat that I grew up on, but mine was also a Tiana 37. So I spent 7 years of my childhood, from when I was 7 to 14, sailing. And this is the place that I call home, the Atlantic Ocean. I was mostly around New England, Maine, Nova Scotia, and Bermuda. But the ocean that I remember was crystal clear waters and this incredible temptation to jump overboard all the time. My parents got really frightened, and they tried to make me watch Jaws to prevent me from throwing myself over the lifelines every chance I got. But the ocean, unfortunately, has changed quite a bit from what I remember. So when I was beginning my PhD work, I went on a research trip with the Algalita Marine Research Foundation aboard this boat, the Algita catamaran. And what we were doing was tracking plastic trash. So it was really jarring for me to see what had happened to the oceans in the many years since I had been at sea. I swam off the Coronados with sea lions. I would do a somersault, and they would do a somersault, and that was great. And then a plastic bag would float by. So I became really concerned about the problem of plastic in the ocean. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized that it's part of my life work to do something about it. I'm having some trouble advancing the slides here. There we are. I noticed that the problem is being framed in various ways that I think independently are not as effective as they would be if we understood it as a cultural and spiritual problem, not only a failure of technology. So this is a beach that is strewn with plastic litter that washes up every time the tide comes in. And in the beginning, this was considered to be an aesthetic problem. And it certainly is. One of the concerns I have about this framing is that the beach, this pristine beach, is for elite vacationers. It's about economics, it's about tourism. The set of tools that we have to address the problem are to move the plastic somewhere else, away, out of sight from the people who are spending their dollars vacationing here. And where does that plastic go once it's cleaned up? It goes to places that we call sacrifice zones. These are some children floating on a makeshift raft, and this is where a lot of subsistence fishing happens. And as we'll see, that is a health issue. When we say clean it up, I'm afraid that what we mean is displacement across populations. So in scientific language, we talk about this as displacement across media. That means we change the plastic from one form, in this case a solid, to something else, like a gas. So if you burn it, incinerate the trash, this is the solution that NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Aeronautic Administration, proposes after the beach cleanups. They have hundreds of tons of trash. They burn it. Well, this creates air pollution. So you can capture that air pollution in the smokestack in a filter, but then that contaminated filter itself will have to go somewhere. So you've shifted it from being a solid waste issue to being an air pollution issue. You take that filter and you move it across space. So now instead of the filter being located in the community that hosted the smokestack, that incineration facility, you have it in a toxic landfill, which someday may leach, and then those contaminants will be released into the groundwater underneath that landfill. And that's another displacement across media, going from the filter into the water. Or we can have displacement across time, where we store things. This is often done with nuclear waste in receptacles that are designed to last for a few hundred years, and then the problem is passed on to another generation. Plastic is forever. There's a slogan that Charles Moore of Algalita Marine Research Foundation likes to say, like diamonds, plastic is forever. So whatever isn't incinerated is still with us somewhere. It's either in landfills or as litter in the ocean or on land, or it's in living beings, much of it in people's bodies and in the bodies of the sea creatures. And another concern I have is when we say we should clean it up, who cleans it up? We see a lot of photo ops of volunteers doing beach cleanups, but a lot of it is low-paid work that is hazardous. These folks are cleaning up after the BP oil spill, and we see that they have no respiratory protection and that it's very hot weather, so they are wearing gloves and boots, but their clothing and a lot of their skin is still exposed. So I will demonstrate, I will not spend a lot of time on it in this webinar, but I will demonstrate through my work how toxic plastic is and how concerned we should be about the people whose job it is to make it and to clean it up. So then the frame became, it's an environmental problem, and it certainly is. This heart-wrenching photograph is by Chris Jordan, who went to the Midway Atoll and photographed albatross. He did set up these photographs. He did not come across the albatross on the beach looking exactly like this, but it is an accurate representation of what is going on. Something like 40% of albatross chicks die from plastic ingestion. And this is an endangered species of bird. 40% of them die before they can reach reproductive age because of plastic ingestion. They are not the only creature that is affected, but we're looking for charismatic species that are either keystone or could move hearts, right? So a lot of this framing is around how it will impact humans if a species is being affected, like the lanternfish, who feed at night. They come to the surface and they ingest quite a bit of plastic. But we don't see posters about lanternfish with their tummies full of nurdles, which are little plastic beads, because they're not as photogenic as the albatross. I had the privilege of helping with an albatross dissection. It was a juvenile black-footed albatross when I was working with Algalita, and it was truly a magnificent bird. But there are so many creatures that are being impacted, and if they're not part of what are termed ecosystem services, purifying the air or the water or providing some other benefit for people, then it's less a part of the conversation. And of course, economics are also something that we dwell on with the environmental stewardship paradigm. So the tools that this discipline offers are legislative remedies, such as ban the bead, the microbead, which is the tiny plastic particles that are intentionally added to exfoliating scrubs and some toothpastes, other cosmetic products, which are designed to whiten our teeth or remove our dry skin. These are tasks that could also be accomplished with things like sea salt, which incidentally contains quite a bit of plastic these days, or oatmeal. To my knowledge, oatmeal doesn't have plastic in it yet, but I don't think anyone studied it. So the Ban the Bead campaign, which is being championed by a great group called Five Gyres, is working to have this practice banned because the beads just wash right down the drain and out into the ocean. Sure, I support the campaign, and I don't use products with microbeads, to my knowledge. But laundering a synthetic garment, so if you have clothing made of acrylic or polyester, nylon, lycra, every time you wash it, up to 30,000, I believe was the number in environmental science and technology, about 30,000 fibers are washed down the drain out into the ocean every time you wash your clothes. So the solution is not to stop washing your clothes, but it's what we call non-point source pollution. It's not something that you can easily legislate. It's not something that is fixed when you stop one polluter from polluting. It's something that each of us has probably in our closet. I try very hard to use organic cotton, hemp, flax, other bamboo natural fibers, but my winter coats that are lined with fleece, that's polyethylene terephthalate from reclaimed water bottles, for example. And it's shedding, and I'm shedding these into the ocean. So we have these other campaigns against plastic bags. This plastic bag is personified as feeling rejected and depressed. California hates him. There's the styrofoam containers, which are also feeling rejected because New York City banned them. But one of the problems with this paradigm is that it can be overturned so easily. The victories are really short-lived. So the New York City ban on styrofoam to-go containers was overturned in court and will not take effect. And then we've got another remedy is recycling. I'll talk more about that. I recycle. I don't think that it's the solution, but it was promoted by industry as a way of escaping what is called extended manufacturer responsibility. The idea that once companies have made a product, they should take it back. They should figure out what to do with it. They should bear the costs of its either disposal or its rebirth as a new product. And recycling was seen by industry as a way of passing that burden on to the consumers. If there's a solid waste problem, it's the consumer's fault. So this was documented in a book called Recycling Reconsidered that I highly recommend. We have this risk assessment process where we believe that we can quantify all of the potential consequences of our actions in the environment and manage these risks. And I get into some great debates with my colleagues who are risk assessment professionals about all of the unknowns. Here are some of these unknowns, just to give you a few examples. The central diagram is about mercury, the story of mercury. So in Minamata Bay in Japan, a factory was releasing elemental mercury, which is not that toxic to people or the environment. Excuse me. But what was happening that they didn't realize was that the microorganisms in the bay were transforming it into the methylated form, which is very, very toxic. It's so dangerous that a famous world-class researcher at Dartmouth spilled a few drops on her gloved hand. It went through the glove and it killed her. Methylmercury, so dangerous. But it's the environment that transforms the elemental mercury into the methyl mercury. So if you do a risk assessment and say, well, we're only releasing elemental forms, there's no risk, you're missing most of the story. Zombie chemicals are another example. These are chemicals that risk assessors say, oh, no worries, it breaks down in sunlight to a non-toxic form. Well, at night, what we're finding is that certain anabolic steroids that are given to cattle for growth promotion actually reform. And then in sunlight, they break down again. And then at night, they reform into the biologically active parent compound. Ozone, something that we talk about in the tropospheric air pollution. When you're in a room with ozone indoors, it reacts with human skin to form something called 4-oxopentanol, which is similar to diacetyl, which causes that popcorn lung damage. My point with all these examples is just that we are so full of hubris, and we don't really know what the consequences of our actions are. And as a person of faith, I find that encouraging, that I do something, I don't know that it actually has any positive impact, but God can take that and transform it and make something out of it. But at the same time, we can't predict. So the last frame is public health problem. I'm a public health professional, so naturally I resonate with this. What goes in the ocean goes in you. This is showing the people who eat sushi are eating plastic bags. This is not hyperbole. The plastic bags break down. They are ingested by fish. When you eat fish, yes, you are indeed eating that plastic bag. IV tubing, medical supplies made from polyvinyl chloride, full of chemicals like phthalates, up to 80% by weight in IV bags and tubing. Phthalates are an anti-androgen, so they interfere with male sex hormones. BPA is often discussed in the press. It's a synthetic estrogen. It's in polycarbonate plastic. It's in some other plastics as a flame retardant. So we focus in this paradigm on individual chemicals, and we focus on trying to understand the harms to human beings from those chemicals. So the tools that public health offers are education campaigns. One of the issues is that education sometimes is misinformation. I love this poster from the American Plastics Council, and it says plastics are an important part of your healthy diet. And in the small print that you may not be able to read, it says, you could think of them as the 6th basic food group. Really? So the remedies we have here, healthcare without harm, trying to take plastic IV tubing and plastic bags, which I just talked about, have these phthalates because they're PVC, and use a different type of plastic instead. We have, again, referencing back to the risk assessments for human exposure. So how much can you eat in a day and still be safe? Very controversial. And then symbols on packages that inform consumers that this plastic is actually safe for food contact or safe for microwave. I would argue from my research, no plastic is safe in the microwave and no plastic is safe for food contact. So we go back and forth with information and estimates of how much is safe and can we substitute this for that? But I would argue that there's something bigger going on. Is plastic a spiritual problem? Do you see the child in the center of this photograph? There's a child swimming. These are actually the offerings during a religious festival that were thrown into the river to give them up to God. So I want to talk for a moment about the ways that we in our communities of faith might be contributing to the problem and the ways that we might be contributing to solutions. So one of the ways that I think we're part of the problem is that in Christianity, we're so good at fear-based and shame-based messages. And we get people to feel really bad about themselves. And a lot of public health and environmental activism has picked up the same approach. We've documented that fear and shame-based messaging have the opposite impact that we intend, because people feel really bad about themselves. They don't have what we would call self-efficacy, a belief that they can do anything differently, that they can be redeemed, that they can change. And when they don't have self-efficacy, then they get depressed and they turn for comfort to whatever the behavior that you're trying to stop is. So let's say you're taking someone who smokes and you say, do you know that's going to kill you? They probably do. Well, I think it's really gross and that's shaming them. And I think you ought to stop. But without giving them the tools to do that, they feel that fear and that shame, and they go have a cigarette to comfort themselves because that's the tool that they know. So can we offer something else? And I would suggest that this, what I call a theology of zero waste, is one alternative. And that is this idea that nothing is beyond God's reach. Everything has intrinsic value. Everything can still be used as part of kingdom building. And when churches that I've been to practice this, I see, for example, in Washington, D.C., I was part for a year. I was really grateful to be part for a year of Church of the Savior. And one of the congregations where I worshiped Eighth Day was a coffee house in Adams Morgan. And folks would come in off the street, and some of them were using substances, and they would be under the influence, and they would wander into our worship service, and we would still stand in a circle and hold hands and pass communion around to each other, and to give that person that we've just met, who has their own set of struggles, and we don't know their story and they don't know ours, and yet we see Christ in each other. So powerful. So the people are not having to split off part of themselves in order to become part of the community. We're not saying that only the parts of you that are presentable, only the parts of you that are beautiful and already healthy are part of the body of Christ. We're saying that we are all necessary, we're all needed, and we all have worth. And I want to contrast that idea with this quote that has just really affected me since I first read it about a year ago. We now know that in a convenience-driven world, a whole apple is too big of a commitment. One of the things that strikes me about this quote is it reflects this culture of, I want to be pragmatic and realistic. We know that in a convenience-driven world, so this is the way things are, a whole apple is too big of a commitment. It's almost as if to say, we can't change that, and we don't want to discuss whether that's the world we want to live in or not. It's just the way things are. The sphere of commitment. So I think a lot about how the way we treat objects, if we treat them as only instrumentally valuable, as disposable, then we start to see ourselves and each other in the same way. And this is my other favorite example to ponder of this disposable culture's disposable communion cups. So instead of the idea of we all drink from the same cup, we share a common fate, we are one in the body of Christ, we have these little sterilized disposable cups that you can open and no one else has touched it, and you can have your sip of the Eucharist wine and then throw it away. And what is the symbolism of this? How is it forming us? So when I was at Church of the Savior in DC, I worked with the Servant Leadership School to lead a course on environmental justice. And I invited the students to pick up a piece of trash and put it in a special place in their room. And I said, during the week when you pray for that piece of trash. Pray that you can see the beauty in it, that you can find the purpose in it. And then let's come back and talk about it at the end of the week. And my students were saying things like, I did that, and the strangest thing happened. I realized I haven't talked to my father in years, and I want to reconnect with him. I don't want to throw away that relationship. Or I realized that there's this other person that I have not been seeing their value, their worth, and I want to reconnect with that. So I think that if we could, well, okay, to back up how that affected me, I was thinking about my own self-worth and how I often compare myself with other people and feel like I don't measure up. And I realized that self-acceptance is the most healing medicine for this problem of disposable culture. Because every time I want to throw something away, it's like I'm wanting to distance myself from what it is in me that I am not comfortable with. Something that's dirty, something that's shameful or broken. But what if all of those parts of myself could be valued and beautiful and useful in my brokenness? I think that's it's so healing in my relationship with Christ, that Christ came in human form, and when he healed people, he touched them, he spit on them. That's kind of gross. I might be offended if I went to the doctor and they spit on me, but this is how Jesus connects with people. And so trying to be sterilized, trying to not touch each other or use the same cup or only present the parts of ourselves that are pure. I think that's what a lot of Jesus's messages were about in terms of hypocrisy. So back to recycling. I think it's a great idea to keep reusing things, and I'm not sure that the language we use around recycling is really the type of redemption that we're looking for. It's kind of ironic, actually. So what happens to a lot of things once we take them to recycling is that they end up in landfills. Like glass is often pulverized and then it's used as alternative daily cover over the garbage that's laid down in the landfill. It doesn't actually get made into a new glass bottle or glass product. So what does redemption mean to us as Christians? It's a question I'd like to leave you with. And this theology of zero waste has to do with Christ, of course, being the cornerstone. The stone that the builders have rejected has become the cornerstone. How does that speak to us as people of faith when we live a lifestyle that takes creation and makes it into garbage? What can we do to reclaim that which is cast off and discarded and make it central? And this, for me, speaks to oppression in society of groups that are marginalized, and how do we recenter them and their experiences and the wisdom and gifts that they have to offer all of us. So in sum, yes, I think it's an aesthetic problem. I think it's an environmental problem. It's a public health problem. And all of the tools that these paradigms offer are useful. But unless we also have a spiritual frame, I don't think we're getting at the underlying issue. So if we think about repentance, it's the opportunity to do things differently, to grieve what we have done that we regret, and conversion, to turn the other way, and to make redemption something other than taking a glass bottle to be pulverized for 5 cents. What does this really mean for the world and the way we can heal the oceans, which is the Atlantic Ocean, I consider my watershed. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Matt, and look forward to hearing about Naboth's Vineyard.
Actually, before we switch over, Sasha, I want to just probe a couple of things that you said, and I want to invite our listeners. You'll have a chance at the end of tonight's webinar to chat in questions or comments that you have for both Sasha and Matt. But I really appreciate this presentation. The chapter that you wrote for the book, Sasha, was stunning, and I first met you a few years ago at a Watershed Discipleship Roundtable in Maryland, and that is where I encountered you as really a prophetic, clear voice about the cultural crisis of not just ecological degradation in general, but very specifically your focus, which is plastics. And so I want to ask you to elaborate just a little bit on the theology, the politics, and the science of your presentation. Theologically, I really think your proposal for what you call a theology of zero waste as a counter move to a culture of disposability, of an economics of disposability, which ends up becoming an anthropology of disposability, I just think is one of the most important theological ideas in this anthology and in the wider conversation. How much resonance have you found with this notion of taking a sort of recycling discourse and reframing it theologically? There is a growing zero waste movement around the country. We're involved with it here in our watershed, but people don't usually think of these things theologically. Do you find that that's getting any resonance in people you talk to?
It depends who I talk to. I think that the zero waste movement in some ways is being co-opted to provide a solution that perpetuates disposable culture. Like, oh, it's okay that we continue to use disposables because it's okay, it will be made into this, your water bottle will be made into a fleece pullover. And there's no discussion there of whose water it was in the bottle in the first place and privatizing a common resource, and do we need to spend fossil fuels to transport it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's sort of like the version of penance that is made fun of in common culture, where you can continue to sin as long as you go to confession and then do some penance. And I have a vision for something bigger than that, where we actually are creating a habit spiritually of valuing that which is discarded, of that which isn't as obvious to us what its purpose is in God's plan, and how that changes our relationship to each other. So I find resonance with it around my godson, who was born with trisomy. And the doctor said he will never be able to speak or walk or contribute to society in productive ways. And yet he brought our eco village together when he was born. We were all saying, let me have a turn taking him for a walk. Let me give you a break. And he's drawing out the love in us in such a beautiful and special way, because he will never judge us. He's this tiny child who can't speak back. And so in these ways that people have experienced feeling thrown out, feeling ostracized, they can resonate with the idea that we can find our way back by changing the relationship we have with things, with the world, that we can find a new relationship with God through that. I think that has been well received.
It's beautifully put in this book. It's a great challenge. Here in our watershed, we lobbied for a single-use plastic bag ban successfully, and became the second city in California to ban single-use plastic bags. Of course, the state eventually, really within 2 years, followed with a statewide ban, but of course that is being challenged in court, just as the New York ban was. What do you think is the lesson that we need to draw from that particular struggle? What do you think the political lesson is?
I'm not good at politics because I want to keep dreaming of what is possible, not just what is practical. But I think that creating that plastic bag ban brought people together. It raised awareness. It educated people. And no matter what the courts decide, that will still exist. And the statewide ban, I know that Algalita and Five Gyres in California are working really hard on these things. So to the extent that it creates community and starts these conversations, I really applaud it. And I just hope that the conversation isn't finished, that people don't feel, okay, we have a ban on plastic bags, great, and we can continue using plastic straws, or we can continue with all of the other ways that we regard things as disposable. So I'd like to hear the conversation really grow to, why is this a convenience-driven world? Why do we need these things? What is a need? What is a want? What really nourishes our soul? Is it being surrounded by things that are beautiful, and each thing that has a story? It's often framed as an elitist conversation. And I think a political message that I have is that it ought not to be an elitist thing to be surrounded by items that are beautiful. I mean, my partner, most of our dishes are from grandparents passed down for generations, and they were bought then from a thrift store, passed down from other people. It doesn't need to be expensive. It can just be that they have memories because they came to us this way. And it's different than picking up some plastic plates at the supermarket. The other story I just wanted to say that really started me down this route was when I worked for an AIDS organization doing education and outreach. One of the patients told me that he was invited home for Thanksgiving, and he was so excited because he'd been disowned. And he went home, and they asked him to sit on the back steps and eat from a plastic plate with plastic cutlery. And the rest of the family didn't sit out there with him. They ate at the table from china inside, and how that made him feel. And now that my partner's mom has cancer and gets Meals on Wheels, they bring her hot dog in a little styrofoam to-go box in a little plastic bag, and they drop it off without touching her, and she eats or doesn't eat that and throws it away, and then there's no reciprocity in that connection. And I just really contemplate how these systems could be changed, whether or not the courts cooperate, whether or not political bodies cooperate, that we can actually be in relationship with each other and in ways that we touch each other. And yeah, so to the extent that these groups do that, great.
You've made a huge contribution to this anthology and to the wider conversation, both theologically as well as scientifically and politically. Sasha has alluded several times to the organization Five Gyres. If you're interested in seeing some of the broader picture of the ecological as well as spiritual crisis of plastics, you have the website there in the chat box, fivegyres.org. It really is one of the extraordinary mapping organizations as well as activist organizations trying to alert us to this really as a cultural crisis. Thank you, Sasha. And there may be some questions that come up at the end of our time, so stick around. Matt, you are beaming to Colombia. There in your office with Arocha, an evangelical environmental organization, and so in that spirit, your contribution to the volume was an attempt to both look at bioregional issues in and of themselves, but also through the lens of a scriptural story. So tell us about that.
Thanks, Ched, and thank you, Sasha. That's fantastic. So yeah, I wrote a chapter on the story of Naboth's Vineyard, and I just want to kind of frame up some of the threads, why these have emerged for me in this discussion in our kind of growing movement around watershed discipleship, and then I'll read a few small sections of the chapter that help kind of frame the argument. So the subtitle of my chapter, it's actually not in the presentation here, this was an earlier version, but the subtitle was Moving from Abstraction to Action. And that's that's a big part of my story and journey that's still very much ongoing. I feel like the more I become aware of the crises that we're facing on the planet and the more engaged I become, the more aware I am of just how easily detached I have been and can continue to be. And the sense that a lot of the culture around me is detached too. I mean, I'm a part of a vibrant kind of subculture of folks who are engaged in these issues, and that feeds me. But you step outside of that not too far, and you realize there's something else going on. And one story I wrote about in the chapter is I teach a couple of classes here at a local Mennonite Bible college. We always do an exercise the first day where I give them some time in groups and then have them introduce themselves and say in about a minute, introduce yourself and your relationship to Christianity and to the environment, to environmental issues. And the best, most intriguing response I ever had was a student who kind of leans back in his chair and says, yeah, most of my life I try not to worry too much about the environment. I just figure I do my thing, let the environment do its thing, and we're good, right? And it was kind of tongue-in-cheek, and he was trying to be clever, and yet I think his sentiment is probably a little bit more broadly shared and not so tongue-in-cheek. And I began to recognize that in myself, that it's easy to speak of these issues in the abstract. And part of what was interesting about my own story, which I'll tell a little more about, is having that located a little bit more here. One of the here, I'm just finding my slides here. Yeah, there's his quote. Look at that. One of the other stories that I tell in my chapters from the writer Alan Durning, who's at the Sightline Institute down in Seattle, and he tells a story of a trip he was on in the Philippines documenting the impacts of environmental destruction on indigenous people there. And he's interviewing elders, and he has this frail old priestess who comes up to him and through a translator asks him, "What is your homeland like?" And he sort of sits and starts to ponder, and he's living in D.C. at the time. He's moved there. He spends most of his waking hours on the road, trying to save the planet, trying to do what's right. And he just, hearing her question, he's kind of skewered by this, that he has, but doesn't even really know what his home is like. He's basically living out of a hotel doing this work. She asks again and again, and finally he looks up to her and he says, "In America, we have careers, not places." And the story writes, "Looking up, I recognized pity in her eyes." And this is another quote that really skewered me when I first read Durning's book a few years ago, realizing even those of us who are interested in engaged environmental issues sometimes consider them very abstractly. And privileging career and mobility and other things is one of those detriments. And it was this Filipina elder that helped Durning sort of move into a new relationship to place. Ultimately, he moves back to Seattle where he had grown up, starts this institute, and I really, really commend his work on this. The other related piece to that abstraction that I experience a lot more when I'm teaching, and I teach at a local Bible college and a seminary and Christian university here, is this sense that the best way that we can solve these issues is to kind of get our theology right or get our worldview in order. And that, to me, too, I think that's good and important, and I've spent some time working on that. But that still lives in a land of idealism and abstraction. And so a lot of what I'm writing about in this chapter is a challenge to myself as much as it is to anyone else. So that's really the first main thread that I'm bringing in from my own story. The second is trying to come to grips with making a home here in British Columbia in a place that's not my own. It's not where I'm from. I came to Canada in 2005, and first 22, 23 years of my life lived in the U.S. in Virginia. And the Humphrey family that I'm a part of had been in Virginia since George Washington was a general. So we had deep roots there. And there was a real sense of uprooting when I moved out here that still is. And that uprooting didn't really dawn on me initially, but has over time. and has led me to ask some questions about how I fit, how I belong here. Part of that is some of the cultural, linguistic differences with my new, cheerful, northerly neighbors, of course. But this has been further intensified as I've engaged over the last couple years with the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission around residential schools. I've learned a little bit about the colonial history of this place and its many deep wounds, and I get into that in the chapter. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this presentation. It makes me realize that I feel like a newcomer to this land, like I don't really have a right to be here. I get reminded that every time I cross the border, because I'm a permanent resident. It's a privilege, it's not a right. And in fact, whether there's something that I am grappling with about being a settler here that frankly a lot of my friends who are second, third, fourth generation Canadians simply don't. So I'm sort of trying to weave together those two threads of abstraction, alienation, along with what it means to be a settler in a place that's not my own. And bioregionalism and watershed discipleship really becomes an important way of locating some of those questions. I spent some time, as Ched mentioned, at Regent College doing a master's in theology, and was able to get a few things in order in my mind, at least, as how some of the bigger theological questions that we're left with. But how does this land on the ground practically? The question I felt like I finished my degree still asking, still probing. Coming to work with Arocha was one step in that journey. And Arocha's work in this area, Arocha, I'll just give a little 1-minute sense of who we are. Arocha is a faith-based organization. It's founded in 1983 in Portugal by Peter and Miranda Harris. And Peter was an Anglican minister, and they had a love of language, a love of culture, felt called to go on mission, and were avid birders, and felt like the church had done very, very little to engage around care for creation. And if you think, if you're discouraged ever looking at how engaged the church, quote unquote, is now on this issue, I mean, if you backtrack those 3 decades, we have become more engaged in that intervening time. And so through the support of some friends and others, they founded this center in the south of Portugal, 1983, and said, we're going to do practical hands-on conservation work. We're going to study what's here. We're going to learn what's happening. And we're going to open our doors to Christian hospitality. So whoever wants to come along and join us, we're going to engage with. Whatever local projects are happening, we're going to provide support for. And over the years, they were found by many people all over the world. And now we're in 20 countries around the world and have serious conversations and about another dozen more about starting up local projects. The projects vary widely based on their region and context. So where we are here in Canada, we're on the west coast of Canada, and the project here for about 15 years has been located just outside Vancouver, kind of tucked in just north of the U.S. border. And a lot of the work here is watershed work on the Little Campbell River. So I've got a couple of slides here to, there's Gary Snyder. Just skipping over a few of these. So this is a picture of the Little Campbell River watershed. To get you some context. Those are the North Shore Mountains, just north of us. This beautiful river and watershed is just about 30 kilometers long, but it does cross 2 countries, 5 municipal jurisdictions, and the majority of it is on unceded traditional lands of Semiahmoo First Nation. So if you look at the image there in front of you, that flat line, that sort of flat white dotted line running east to west, that's the border. So you'll see that big chunks of our watershed are south of the border and flow into it. If you see on the left-hand side of the screen the coast that kind of curves down towards the right, there's a very, very small treed area there that Semiahmoo First Nation, that's all that's left, the reserve there of their traditional lands. So this is a 30-kilometer long river, and yet all told, it's implicated in over 10 different political jurisdictions. And of course, the salmon that spawn here every October, it's one of the things we look forward to, as the property where we do our work is right on the river. The salmon return and spawn. Those salmon are traveling up and down the coast quite far as southern Alaska and to northern California. Here's a few images of some of the species at risk that live here, as well as a former intern of ours. So we do conservation work, trying to study and learn what are the species that live in this watershed, what are the health of their populations, and then we partner with landowners and other groups to do restoration projects. I could get into some more of the details around Arocha maybe with questions. I don't feel the need to go into lots of that now, but if you sort of try and envision a small retreat center, a small kind of intentional community, an organic farm, and then a conservation education center sort of woven together, that would give you something of the flavor of what we're doing here. And we're able to host people, so we invite folks to come and partner with us. So this watershed, here's the salmon species that live in the watershed here. There is a ladder and a gate, so we do have a hatchery on the river that track very closely the salmon populations every year. Moving out then from our little watershed, because we're right on the border, it's just such a perfect illustration of the ways that what we're doing here is implicated more broadly. And this bioregion is known as Cascadia. You'll even see a pretty broad and supportive movement to try and create a sovereign place known as Cascadia. It includes British Columbia, part of Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and into the edges of Idaho. Sorry, I just lost my page here. So that's I think all I'll say about bioregionalism and watershed management. The third kind of thread that is woven into this for me and is woven into the chapter I wrote really is the biblical text. There's loads that could be said about the role of land and place in the biblical story, and Scripture doesn't present us with a sort of simplistic or uniform view on this. I recognize all of that. But there are a number of important and very probing pieces that we can look at here. One of the people who I've learned a lot from is Ellen Davis, and Davis's work really seeks to locate Israel's creaturely life in their place, and to give an account of that's a whole lot more nuanced and a whole lot different than anything I've experienced and grown up with. So she writes this: taken as a whole, biblical law seeks to inculcate a precise awareness of physical being, of human life in a particular place, the land of Canaan, shared with other creatures, trees, birds, and animals whose own lives are precious and vulnerable. So the biblical law, Old Testament Hebrew law, she says, orients human life in the particular place, in the land, the promised land, and towards the one true sovereign of the land, Yahweh. Israel's invited then to continually recognize and profess that in fact Yahweh was the true sovereign of the land was not theirs, they did not own it. As Leviticus 25:23 states, the land is mine, and you are but aliens and tenants. But that stipulation became rather difficult for Israel's kings, of course, whose claims over the land and labor inevitably come into conflict with that of Yahweh. And on that in particular, Wes Howard Brooke has done some really insightful work that I've made mention of in the paper. So this conflict over how we live in the land, over who is sovereign over the land, who has a right to the land, and how that's situated theologically is demonstrated rather poignantly for us in this tale of Naboth's vineyard. So I want to take a few minutes now to just walk through that text and then ask some questions about how that might relate in my watershed, and I think probably to many of ours. So the story of Naboth's vineyard is found within the extended drama of King Ahab and the prophet Elijah. And Ahab has the record of doing more evil in the sight of the Lord than all of Israel's kings before him. He marries Jezebel, daughter of King Ethbaal of the Sidonians, and sets up an Asherah pole and worships Baal in blatant defiance of Torah's prohibitions. His actions kindled the jealousy of Yahweh, but they also betray a broader conflict between Israel's identity and that of the surrounding nations. And so the contest, the sort of famous contest between the prophets of Baal and Elijah to end the drought, are, in Timothy Gorange's understanding, epitomizing this standoff between two different cultures, two different economies, and two different ways of viewing the relationship between the people and the land and God. And this is the same conflict that we see emerge in the story of Naboth's vineyard. So King Ahab now has a palace in Samaria, and he desires Naboth's vineyard in nearby Jezreel. This is a modern image of the Jezreel Valley. Davis notes it was the richest agricultural region in the country. It still is today, as you can see from the green image. And Ahab comes and makes what appears to be a fair offer, at least by modern standards. He'll either trade comparable land or pay fair market price for it. So the king comes to the peasant, says, I see that you have this vineyard. It's near to my place. Can we make an exchange? Here's the text. Ahab said, let me have your vineyard to use for a vegetable garden since it's close to my palace. In exchange, I'll give you a better vineyard, or if you prefer, I will pay you whatever it's worth. Naboth replied, the Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors. And Davis points out that Naboth's objection is based upon religious purity. The Hebrew word is halilah, from which we get halal. So we might better render this phrase, I would be defiled before Yahweh. I would be made ritually unclean should I give you my ancestral inheritance. And moreover, she adds that the Hebrew word nahalah, which is often translated as portion, possession, or inheritance, all of those translations signify some form of property ownership, but this is precisely what the connotation that this word is intended to undermine. Nehalah signifies a land given as a gift or a trust, and this harkens back to the distribution of land to the 12 tribes. So she argues, and this is echoed by many others, that the more accurate translation of Nehalah may well be tribal lands or ancestral lands. So in this case now, Naboth's response, the Lord forbid, it would make me unclean to sell, to marketize my ancestral lands, suddenly becomes a really stunning response, I think, for us today, and I'll make mention of that. The rest of the story reads really like a kind of modern political coup. When Jezebel, Ahab's wife, finds him sulking in the bed after he's confronted by Naboth, she sweeps into action, falsifies a letter from the king to the village elders, and pays scoundrels to bring false charges against Naboth, who a few verses later is stoned to death in the village square. And she then goes back to her husband Ahab and tells him it's time to go and take possession of the land of Naboth. And the king does ultimately go in and take possession. And Ahab has now forcibly integrated Naboth's land into his own project for his own gain. Before the story ends, of course, as is often the case, we have the prophetic word that comes in response to the actions of Ahab. And Elijah comes in this wonderful image and confronts Ahab, unmasking the truth of his murderous scheme, and asks, have you killed and taken possession? And this question, I think, is the one, when I first read this and began to study about this, that unsettles me the most, and really, I think, ought to unsettle all of us who have become settled in this place, in our region. Have we killed and taken possession? Have we participated in a body politic whose supposed success is predicated on a history of dispossession? And have we been willfully ignorant of that fact and of its ongoing legacy, as I have been for very much of my adult life? One of my favorite poets, David White, often quotes the Irish proverb, "The thing about the past is it's not the past." And I think this is particularly true once we recognize this tight relationship between land and identity. And that's a relationship that bioregionalism helps us to see and understand more deeply. So I want to just now spend the closing moments talking about how this text reads my context here as a newcomer to Cascadia, and how this legacy of violence and dispossession is a painful one that lives on in real faces and real lives today. Now, as I said before, this really came right before me reading about and following the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this commission was charged with hearing and recording the stories of survivors of Indian residential schools, which operated between 1886 and 1996 across Canada. So I'm not that old. I was 13 years old when the last one closed right here in British Columbia. After a five-year process, the commission chairperson, Justice Murray Sinclair, said this at the time of the report's release. He said, "Removed from their families and home communities, 7 generations of Aboriginal children were denied their identity, and we heard how separated from language, culture, spiritual traditions, their collective history, children became unable to answer questions as simple as, where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And who am I?" Survivors were stripped of the love of their families, stripped of their self-respect, and of their identity. And this very violent process was carried out in schools, by and large run by churches, and funded through the Federal Department of Indian Affairs. Children were forbidden to speak their native language, practice customs, or to disobey school authorities. Many unknown thousands died of disease, and far more were subjected to physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. The report concludes that what occurred in residential schools was nothing short of a cultural genocide. And residential schools were seen by the federal government at the time as the, quote, final solution to the, quote, Indian problem, which had been articulated as far back as the Indian Act of 1876. This was written with the express intent of driving Native peoples to renounce their Aboriginal identity, to adopt a European way of life, and to become integrated to the newfound Canadian culture. This act goes on to limit what rights the new nation of Canada will recognize on newly founded reserved lands, which is different from the property rights that it had enacted in the lands it had already dispossessed. And it restricted possibilities for broader enfranchisement. And so this long story of dispossession and really of resource extraction is a founding sort of story of this place that I now call home. And yet, you know, my wife is from Vancouver. She grew up here. She was never told this story. This is not the story that is known. We have very positive images of, you know, French and English traders on the Hudson Bay River gathering their beaver pelts. We don't know necessarily what follows that and the violence, but from that time to the forestry and the gold rush booms of the 19th century, and now the fight over fossil fuel extraction here on the west coast of Canada, this is an important part of our context here. And I think Elijah's question, have we killed and taken possession, is one that ought to slow us, steady us, and sort of refocus some of the types of responses that we may want to give. There are many environmental challenges we're facing here. The ongoing fight for around pipelines is active. Just about a year ago, there was a big fight with the proposed Kinder Morgan pipeline at Burnaby Mountain, which is just about 30 minutes from here. And when they began drilling within a conservation area on Burnaby Mountain, this was in defiance of a municipal bylaw. But in Canada, the ways that different jurisdictions have power, it gets really murky. So because the pipelines are considered as a kind of an economic and an export market, the federal government has jurisdiction. But when it comes to other issues around land, often it defers down to provinces and even to municipals. So you have this jurisdictional battle that's happening. And so many people went up to protest the work, to interfere with the work being carried out by Kinder Morgan. And many blockaded and were arrested. And one of those arrested was Lynn Cornby, a biochemistry professor here at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. And you know things are going in an interesting direction when a understated biochemist is willingly going in the back of the police van. Kinder Morgan then slapped her and 4 others with a court injunction against speaking out in opposition to the project, which she did, claiming that the protesters were costing the company $80 million per month in delayed financial benefits. So the charge is no longer against king and country, as was the trumped up case against Naboth in our biblical tale, but now it's blasphemy against the future profits of the oil company. And standing in the way of their progress is blasphemy of the highest order for the ruling ideology of our time. But Cornby was interviewed about this, and this is her response. Let me just see if I have her. Yeah. She says, "What is the value of owning my home and having a retirement savings if our world is spiraling into this negative space? If there is no freedom of speech in Canada, if there's no intergenerational justice, if there's no global justice, then what is the value of my own home?" Ultimately, the court case was dropped against her, but it looked as though she could be taken on a very long legal battle at the time. And her quote here, I think, is a modern invocation of the Nahala, of the refusal to put market values ahead of intergenerational justice, of recognition of the sacred value of the land as it was given to those who originally inhabited it. And so this poses a question for us in this bioregion. How are we to carry out good conservation work, good environmental justice work? How are churches to engage this ongoing legacy of dispossession? I certainly don't propose to have answers to all of those questions in my chapter, but it has reframed for me what it means to be a steward of this place, to be a settler, to try to be a settler ally. And that brings us, I think, in a way, kind of full circle to my student sort of sitting back in his chair and assuming his faith and life had so little to do with the environment, and full circle really to the story of Naboth's vineyard, because one of the things that's most stunning about that text is that once challenged by Elijah's prophetic word, Ahab repents, and he does so publicly with sackcloth, with ashes, with the whole bit. And this is not what we should expect from where the story is leading. But confronted with the legacy of his actions, from expropriating land from this peasant, he turns and repents. And this, I think, gives us hope that even the worst perpetrators can be redeemed, can be changed, can be transformed. And perhaps we can be moved into a different form of action when we're confronted with this history and when we're prompted by the Spirit. Another story I tell, just closing up here in my chapter, I had the real privilege to share a podium with Eddie Gardner, who's a Stalo elder from the Squaw First Nation here locally. And we did a day together at this Mennonite Bible College looking at biblical and First Nations views around creation. Eddie was very, very gracious. And he came up to me after and he thanked me and we started talking. And then he gets this little gleam in his eye. This was about 1.5 years ago, right when everything was happening on Burnaby Mountain. And he says, if this is really what you believe, then you're going to have to come up and join me on Burnaby Mountain. And I just was gutted. He's right. and I don't know what to do. People had just been arrested. It was all in the news. We were having a big discussion with Arocha. How do we engage this? What's the way to do it, etc. But I did. I went up a couple of days later with about 600 others. It turned out he invited in a few more. And there was a circle of elders drumming and singing and dancing and speeches and some symbolic action. And it felt for me like this confirmation of the arc of movement into action in and for a place. And even recognizing it's maybe not my rightful place, but to stand with those who have been so poorly dispossessed of this land and to engage as allies alongside them. So that's the chapter that I've written.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate this weaving together of personal narrative, political narrative, scriptural narrative, bioregional narrative, in the spirit of watershed discipleship. What I'd like to do, while I invite our listeners, if they want to text in some questions, is I want to invite the two of you, Sasha and Matt, to reflect on the connections you see in each other's presentation, in each other's chapter. There's certainly themes of disposability in what Matt has shared, and so I want to invite you just to take a couple minutes, just reflect to each other back what you're hearing each other say. Sasha, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. I was really moved by the story of the king's repentance. And I know that in my own activism, I get tempted to think, oh, here's an enemy that I can put in that category and leave there. And what I hear you saying, Matt, is that repentance is possible for everyone, and even maybe transnational oil companies, even for us settlers who are on land that we took by force, that we have a possibility too of realizing the harm that we've caused and trying to make amends. So I really am touched by that and resonate with that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still digesting all of what you shared. And what about you?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we won't organize around the oil companies repenting, but we can hold out hope, eh? Yeah, I think the piece in yours that I was that I would really want to echo is when you said that we the ability to see things as disposable leads us to see people as disposable, or places. I've just been reflecting a lot about like how did we get into the mindset where all of the disposability is so normal, because it wasn't normal that long ago, right? So and that I think is on a little bit of a parallel with, yeah, how do we treat land as simply a market commodity? So, you know, if Johnny loses the family farm in Minnesota that has been in his family for 4 generations because, you know, the price of corn was low, well, that's kind of sad, but that's the market. There's just an inevitability to this, to treat it really as normal and fine, and that raises a real problem for me of how have we chosen to value things in that way. So I think confronting some of the effects, which your research really aids us to do, has to be a starting point. Just as I think confronting the effects of our violent history has to be some sort of a starting point for us here.
Kind of contrasting this idea of eminent domain and my possession, my inheritance, the commons. How are these different ways of looking at land shaping who we are as a people?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Matt, your decision to stand with Indigenous folk and others on Burnaby Mountain was a really transforming one for you. You talk about it a little bit in your chapter. Tell us give us an update on that particular pipeline struggle, and there are other pipeline struggles happening in BC. Give us a little update on that, and also give us a little update on how you feel like you've changed as a result of making that choice a little more than a year ago.
Yeah, well, Chad, I thought you were going to give me the easy questions and give Sasha the hard ones, so thank you. Yeah, no, that's so. Well, quickly on the pipeline update, we're now in. I mean, the easiest way that I can explain it, I taught a course in geography last year on resource management, which is a wild journey of how I got to teach that, and I'm not qualified to, but they let me. And I had a great environmental lawyer come in and give a guest lecture, and he said that the battle is going to be over jurisdiction. Who has jurisdiction to carry this out? One of the biggest differences now is the favorable ruling to the Chilcotin case in the Canadian Supreme Court, which essentially recognizes by the Supreme Court the rights of tribes, of groups to their to a larger claim on their ancestral land. So it's the same conflict that we're reading about in this text. It just jumps off the page. That has everybody wondering what its implications will be now for these development cases, because it does give a precedent for a legal fight. Many of these groups can't afford that fight, but it gives a precedent, right? So that's now, in a sense, tied up in some ways. The biggest public fight that's happening right now is within the province over this massive Site C dam project in northern British Columbia, which essentially our premier of the province was really elected on the promise of getting this going, and she's running out of time in office to do so. It would flood Treaty 8 land. It would flood the best farmland in northern western British Columbia, et cetera, and we don't really need the power it would generate unless we are going to try and liquefy natural gas for export. So that's now getting a lot of the attention and debate. So that's, there's more to say on that. In terms of, my own engagement and involvement, I think one of the things that I really wrestle with is a desire to be engaged and to speak out, with a desire to have people to speak to. And so Arocha as an organization, I think, has tended to shy away from direct political calls, in part because of our charitable status, and in part because we want to build bridges as far and as wide as we can. I think this experience for me kind of confirmed, I want to continue to do that with some nuance and care, but what it counts is where I'm willing to go and put my body at some key times. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm, as a permanent resident that doesn't even really have a legal right to remain in Canada, I have to do that with some care. But that's a question that continually prompts me in the work and the teaching that I do, for sure.
Well, you might notice that a couple of our listeners are going back and forth talking about community land trusts, which is a movement that's been around for quite a while, but is sort of finding new traction in a new generation all over the country now, as folks question the market dominant paradigm and try to figure out how to hold land in stewardship and in trust, particularly for the future. So I know that's a movement both in New England that Sasha's aware of, and also in Cascadia. Well, I want to invite each of you to maybe just to give a final word. It's been so wonderful having you on here. Any final words, Sasha, that you want to offer to folk?
I've been trying to think of how to frame this in a positive way instead of no to disposability. How do I frame it as a yes? And so the final word is just that one way we can practice seeing Jesus in his most clever disguises is finding the beauty and the value in the things that we throw away.
Thank you. And Matt, before you give your last word, I want to point out that our mutual friend Laurel Dykstra has, in the last year, begun a Watershed Discipleship worshiping group in your neighborhood there in BC. And at key points in that community, they have gathered right there on your own land in Arocha. Has that been a nice collaboration for you and the Watershed Discipleship community?
Yeah, it has, and in fact, we're going to be sitting down tomorrow to plan some of the final details around a 2-week Sacred Earth summer training course that she's hosting for youth, and it's going to be hosted out at Arocha's facility in partnership with a whole lot of really interesting people that she's connected with. So it's a wonderful, fruitful engagement for us. And I hope will be a fruitful one for our broader movement.
I'm so pleased that you are collaborating with the Salal and Cedar Watershed Discipleship folk. So a final thought from you, Matt?
Yeah, well, one of the sort of closing thoughts I gave in the chapter that I haven't mentioned is this. Is the building on Ahab's repentance is Jesus' turn that the meek will inherit the earth. That there is a power at work in our humility and our repentance. Meekness gets a pretty bad rap, but doing a little word study on that, there's more there to it, and I think it does give us something of the tone and posture that we may want to carry forward as Watershed disciples.
Well, again, thank you so much, both of you, for your contributions to this, and to those of you either listening live or listening to this recording, we do want to commend this anthology to you. Next month will be the last installation in this 5-month series. In our final 2 contributors, Katerina Friesen and Vickie Machado, will be talking about their work. Katerina particularly talking about a theme that Matt touches on in his chapter, the doctrine of discovery, and its interesting relationship with watershed concerns. And Victoria talks about the parallels between watershed discipleship and the Catholic worker movement. So please be sure and join us. We rely on word of mouth. So let your friends and colleagues know about this series. Again, if you've missed any of the series, they are all recorded and available on our website. The anthology will be out at the end of the year. Its title is Watershed Discipleship, Reinhabiting Bioregional Faith and Practice, and we've got 12 wonderful chapters by each as passionate and depthful as what you have heard from Matt Humphreys and Sasha Adkins. So one last time, thank you, Sasha and Matt, for joining us tonight. Thank you all for joining us as per usual. I will let the chat function as folks chat in their gratitude. But thank you all for joining us, and so long. We will see you next month.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jed.
Have a good night.
Good night.